Guys, this is Meeker here, back with another video. This one's going to be a updated, more or less meta attack guide. I think it kind of differs for every company. There's a few different variations that I'll go into with this, but this is generally the most popular strats I've seen across NA and EU, and I think NA and EU, at least most the early strats are kind of similar. The fort strats always kind of get more unique. There's a lot of different fort strats, and there are a decent amount of viable ways to win in fort. But I'm going to be covering like the more popular ones at the moment. I know in a video I did recently, I talked about how you could put decks outside of B. I think that's still somewhat of a case. It's also a rule that some people have broken and have figured out ways to not have to put decks outside B, but still have pressure, say, from running Blunderbuss in that slot in light, so that there's a significant amount of damage on the B choke, or they'll just kind of not take an engagement. So people that play in the B choke on a defender standpoint just get shot, and there's not much for them to do, so they'll back off. But I'll get into that when I get into that. And for the sake of this, I'm saying 1 through 3 are Deady Point, 4 through 8 are ball, and 9 through 10 are decks. This is like a fairly standard split. I think 1 to 2 groups being ball is, or sorry, 2 to 3 groups being ball is fairly standard in those armies where there are two groups that are ball, and then there's not a third group. One ball group sort of acts like a Deady group. It might not have Deady players in it, or like people that play that sort of role, but it will still function like a Deady group, which is why I group it in here. So it is kind of traditional now to have Grid X Warhammers in like a Deady Point group. In EU, they will be in heavy. In NA, a lot of people will break that rule and run medium. At this point, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal to me, but there are times where I see people that are in medium that would live in heavy, and there are times where I've seen heavy players just die, and it did not matter that they're heavy with the way that they're playing, and they would just die anyway. So I can kind of see that swinging either way, but end of the day, those bruisers and those Deady groups tend to be running stone form. Ball groups are pretty standard at this point to be 2 Great X Warhammers, 1 to 2 IGVGs, and 1 to 2, well, sometimes even 0 blunderbusses. And those blunderbusses at this point are typically either light or low con medium. Typically they are light. The reason why people tend to prefer light is light can effectively kill more builds right now, and also with Mortal Empowerment being broken, a decent amount of people, or not broken, but like significantly overtuned, a decent amount of people play it in light, and then they'll run stone form so that they live a little bit better, and they'll just try to farm as much as they can. I think there is a somewhat of a debate of like what players or what slots get used in the Deady Point, with some people favoring the bruisers more, other people favoring, say, heavy IGBBs more. Some people don't believe in heavy IGBBs, some people believe in bile, some people don't believe in bile. So there's a lot of debate on the Deady Point side, but the ball side is very standard. Decks at this point tend to be mostly bows and muskets, and a little bit of light melees, but not a ton of light melees. And the people that are light melees, a decent amount of companies have those light melee players, which often go to bow during fort phase, because bow tends to be better in fort, but the light melee tends to do a little bit better than bow outside, but bow is still very strong outside of fort. So that being said, getting into this, I think it is typical at this point to 50 mana side point. The reason why is there are basically easy mistakes that happen if you don't 50 mana side point, where there are times where you go into wars and you say don't have a side point for 5 minutes, and that's just does not make sense, but it happens where defenders will target muskets to be people on the free point, and they'll just shoot them. So it tends to kind of force pressure and cause mistakes. And because of this, people tend to either 50 or 45 man the free point, and then they'll send like a solo musket group or some sort of dex group to the far side point that can contest the people that shoot them from the walls, and also can shoot people who are approaching them who are not muskets, which tends to pull more people than the actual group itself, which is why it's like normally run. I have seen it be as much as 10 people, but it kind of depends on the army and depends on the server. But typically this is done now. The 50-man B strat isn't bad, but I think is map dependent. If you do a 50-man B strat, just make sure you don't get LS'd by certain like geometry from the map, like in terms of pills or whatnot, that your healers won't be able to LOS you from and heal you. Like in Everfall, that's a particular problem. If offenders don't buy haste and the healers don't get over the hill, then sometimes you can just get farmed on attack if you try to 50-man B because of that like hillside. And then typically the point that you fund a 50-man is the point that you would struggle with the most to actually take. So even though it's like 50-man to free point, it's not necessarily the free point, it's the point that you don't really want to deal with. So if you don't really want to deal with like on Brightwood, if you don't want to deal with like the rock ridge per se that people like to camp at, then maybe 50-man that one. If you don't like the hills uh on Everfall, then maybe 50-man C. Like it's just kind of depends on the map what you prefer. They don't necessarily go for the free point because the defenders try to contest this and they don't contest it correctly. They can very easily just lose all 3 side points, and it's almost guaranteed that if you contest a free point and you lose from a defender's perspective, that you're going to lose the B point as well, which is why it's not normally done. It seems very, very hard at this point in the game to try to retake space if you lose that space around a point from a defender perspective. I have not seen a company successfully like retake A or C once the attackers get it ticked and they wipe people off of it once. So that's just a little bit noteworthy as well. Usually after that free point is captured, people will kind of rush to B. There is like a zerg mentality when this happens. People are just kind of formulating like sort of a wall, but not necessarily linear like this. I would say the more spread you're out when you attack, generally the better you are. And another bright side of this 50-man is your healers are basically perfectly spaced because all this perfectly safe because all this space that's behind them is spot that you just cleared since your main ball is running through it. So that it's very hard for your healers to get ambushed on B versus if you do the split, then the kill squad group should in theory be able to shoot healers on the defender side, which will usually be anchored on opposite side of B because they want to be away from where the ball is coming, so they're right in range of the decks, which makes them easier pickings. At this point, there's more or less a 50-50 that happens. If you die, some people will send people to C, other people will send groups back to B. There's usually a decent amount of splitting happening. You're basically trying to force the defenders to have to only contest 1 point. You do see some territories where this doesn't happen. In EU, they don't ever really go for splits like this. They just play strictly for zone control on a singular point. You don't even talk about split strats whatsoever. But split strats tend to result in either B or C being capped very, very easily, and it's very popular in NA. But you see people like Parabellum try to take that shortcut sometimes, and sometimes it works fine. Other times they do not get into fort until 5 minutes is left, which is what happened last war. So a little side note there. Usually when you're taking B after you kind of get presence, you anchor your point team and everyone else surrounds the space that people are trying to contest from. Usually this will be more towards their road and more towards C side. You want to try to get the early rotate to C, and the space that's usually behind you on A side will just be contested by your respawn, so you're really trying to push into the other space that your respawns will naturally contest, so that your respawns can mop up the other people that are left behind. Usually also while this is happening, musket slash dex groups will try to get on the far side of C because this is where healers normally play, and if they're able to live over here, they basically just single-handedly win the C point. You see this very often in NA with people like Smirks trying to take this angle all the time. It's very effective, very hard to deal with because people can't really force them out because they have better mobility. And then if they get to sit here for free, basically all the healers on C side are not safe, which forces healers to play more in the road up by the fort. But that's not a safe spot from the zerg rotation that usually happens, where people usually send people to clear that area. So it just puts healers in a really rough spot, and healers normally die from this sort of pincher setup. So you have to be really wary as a defender and try to contest that like C early musket rotation early. Otherwise, you could very often just lose C point right after you lose B, which honestly seems more like a commonplace now to lose C right after you lose B. I don't see many people holding C for significant periods of times versus good companies. Seems like B always goes down around like 22 to 25 minutes, and then C goes down within a minute or two after that. And that's just because there's nowhere safe for healers to stand normally. And I think if you wanted to prevent this, you would need to basically be willing to give B up early, establish positioning on C, and make sure that your healers are safe from these musket groups. Usually, if you're looking to cap C and you're not as confident in this, you're trying to get your bodies on C, you're trying to control the space that your healers are playing, you're trying to invade the spot where their healers are playing. Usually that's with their kill squads. And then you're also trying to control the way that their respawns flood in. If the respawns are contested when they flood in, they will basically not be able to recontest point, and you'll be able to win the C point very easily. And when stuff gets closer, then you obviously want to bunch up. Going to fort phase, people usually 50-man zerg the first gate. I would say that pretty consistently now at this point, range should just be shooting horns and not be shooting gate, because if the gate breaks first, then Bruisers have nothing to do. and the range then have to shoot the horns. So in order to save time, it makes more sense for range people just to shoot horns and versus just to hit gate and not really worry about the fight that's happening outside. And then once the gate is broken, I would say rotate. I wouldn't say wait for all the horns to be broken to rotate. The reason why is usually when you are going to B and then going to C. If you wait for all the horns to get broken here, then you're just going to have wasted time on this point. You're going to have wasted time on this point. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think you should just try to rotate as fast as possible and then mop up the horns on your own gate when you have downtime. You should be able to get them down before you do a significant push in, but just make sure to pry the horns on the inside first because those are the most important ones and the ones up top second, which is a very common mistake I see. So usually after you get that first point, like I said, you rotate off. Normally people will start off with a 10 man on C, 10 man on A, and about 20 man on B at the moment, and then they'll do 5 on both back gates just to get them down and have that threat to go through back gates. But would say going through back gates at this point is not a very common concept. And that if it is done, it's not normally done by Dex groups, but Dex groups usually are the first people to get to be sent there to break the gates. But after that first rotate, Dex groups usually end up defaulting to either A or C or a combination of both because those tend to be the gates where Dex players can have the most impact and get in the easiest. Since back gates have the longest rotation out of any gate, and it's also the hardest rotation to get through, it makes generally more sense if you're going to go for those back gates to put a ball group on a back gate than it does to put a kill squad group there. Since it's very hard for healers to live, and the ball groups can contest that choke space a little bit better. Usually at the point where you get all the gates down, this is what it looks like. It's what I just described. A 20 man on B, I think at this point is like fairly normal. I have seen this to be as much as 30 in a typical war. I have seen instances where people bump that up to even 50. I think if you're going past 30, you're going to hit significant diminishing returns, and that B choke is not really large enough to accommodate that many people being on B gate. Usually, you either have a dex group, I think, with this B gate that primarily consists of bows, just to keep people out of that choke, or you could put blunderbuss in there that are lighter in con and tend to do more damage, and that will also help get through that choke. The alternative is you could also just be the better melee players, and you can kind of play on the sides, and if they want to play in the choke early, that's fine. They'll just get shot. And if they don't play in the choke early, then you can just kind of rush through later. You see that from Egoed a lot in NA, where Egoed will just not attempt to go through the gate until later on. You also see a lot of companies uh, try to slot an SNS on the B gate in this kind of position. And if there's a matchup where there's an SNS versus a non-SNS, the team with the SNS almost always acquires more space in that B choke and has a significant advantage, which is part of the reason why SNS is primarily run now. There are some companies that don't run the SNS. SNS in particular is very, very good in Fort, but a little bit less good outside of Fort. That being said, I think it's just a solid build in general, and this is one of the main reasons why I consider running it, because if you have an SS and the other team does not, you basically can walk through the choke for free. But if you both have an SNS, that kind of cancels out, and then if one team has an SNS, that team tends to be favored unless you do a play where you try to not send many people to B, and in a small scale PvP, then SNS tends to be weak. But the current meta at the moment is for B to be the area that people push the most, which is why SNS tends to get a lot of value since those B fights tend to be heavier, and the later the war goes, the more people tend to want to flood through B. So SNS basically gets more valuable the later in the game that you are in a war. One common strat that you see a lot too is you'll see people rotate from the side gates back to the main ball, and then they'll do a heavier stack here. This is in order to kind of create a numbers advantage, and it's also really hard to see this rotation from the side of the point because people on defense normally hold this sort of lane here, and from that lane you can't actually see this like rotation happen since you could only see like this sort of angle, and you can't really see these players that well. So it's a really easy rotate to make, kind of a hard rotate for the defenders to spot. And if that happens, then you are looking at a kind of dire situation sometimes where B gate can be significantly outmatched. Say you have a 20v30 on B gate, the 30 man almost always wins that, and then you have to worry once people are in the fort. I'm going to go through a couple other alternative strategies before I go into what you do in fort, though, and then have like a kind of brief run through of what you do in fort. I think getting through the gates is the primary concern for most people, not what you do in fort at this point, so I'm going to focus on that. Another common strategy that you see is a kind of a 2-gate zerg split, where people heavy stack one gate with decks, and then they'll stack the other gate with normal groups. This works particularly well because it reduces the amount of rotations the B gate has from side gates, and the B gate only has to worry then about like rotation from one side, and the side gate tends to get in for free when this happens because no one else can really help them with the rotate except for people in the back gates. So this tends to be a really easy way to get through the chokes for free, and this is what I believe what Supple did, or a variant of this, to win their most recent attack in like 15 minutes. Another common strat that is like the older strat that you see still is where people zerg one side of the point and they try to contest one side of the point heavily, overwhelm people on that side, and then just take space control for free. And then usually once you win one of those strats or a different strat on the gates, the most common mechanism is to go up top, wait for your B gate to win that fight, get value on point, start ticking the point, and then when the defenders start panicking, that's when you kind of start going in. And that's when you actually get off the walls. Typically, it's best to play close to a staircase on the wall instead of far away. The reason why I want to play close is because the closer you play to one staircase, the further the distance the enemy is away from ganking you. And this rotation is much harder to make than the rotation up the stairs, so people tend to go up the stairs, but it's going to LLS their healers naturally and puts the offenders actually on an advantage, even though they're on top of the fort because they're basically playing defense on top of the fort. The con to this is healers can very easily be shot by muskets, but these areas on B gate tend to be the safest spots for people to hang out. And then after there's point tick, people will typically drop. There are some companies that will drop people early and not worry about the point tick aspect as much. I think the point tick is really, really free. You just, at this point where you get people up top, you just kind of send your Zerg through B because it's really hard for people to contest the people up top and the Zerg. So if your point team wins when people are up top, you're basically guaranteed to win the 4. And even if you get to the point where you're up top and you're actually living up there, that's usually a spot where you're going to win the war in the next 5 minutes. There are some people who avoid this like whole going up top situation. Instead, people will try to spread around the fort. That can work well. The major con to that is it's very hard for healers to live unless they're up top and uncontested, or they're in B gate and they're uncontested, which is why I would recommend in general trying to prio going up top. But there are circumstances where some people will have groups that play for stage control to camp respawns, which is very common. And when that kind of stuff happens, then those areas are usually safer for healers to play as well. And then healers are actually able to live inside of the fort. I'd just say it's a lot less common, and typically for most companies, it's a safer strat to try to get up top and try to live and take the fight up top. And while that fight is happening, you want to send people through B on a Zerg. The other problem I see sometimes is when this sort of thing happens where you tell people to get up top and for your Zerg to happen. I see a lot of IGLs be like, okay, we're going to wait till the next respawn wave and then we're going to go in. The problem with that is the people up top tend to be on a timer until they get forced off. And if you wait till that respawn wave, then you're basically not going to have enough time to do this kind of coordinated drop play. So I would argue that you want to send your Zerg through B immediately once people start getting up top. And you want to play for that pressure as fast as possible. And once defenders are in a spot where they have to decide between B gate and going up top, that's usually in a spot where you win for free. And there's also an aspect of when this happens that you can send people through the side gates for free, and a lot of stuff opens up. So that's how a really easy way to start getting space in the fort is by putting people up top. It just expands the amount of space that the defenders have to contest and makes it a lot easier overall. So yeah, I wouldn't say this is like a one strat fits all thing, but this is, I would say, a more common strategy at this point to be seen, especially the not a 50 manning these points. I think the 50 man idea isn't awful if you have a ton of Dex players and you just think you could overpower them on B, but I think it's generally weak because it struggles versus Dex players on the walls. That being said, if you're versus a company that has like 2 muskets or 2 bows slotted and that's it, and you do a heavy Zerg through B and you have a bunch of decks, you could very often just win off of that alone. It's just like the conditional of having people up top to shoot you while this is happening tends to stop the this 50-man strat from working. Okay. But yeah, that's what I have for this one, guys. I would just say be really careful with these like early phases, and then this like kind of pre fort phase. You should be able to get to this point where you're actually hitting the gates. And this meta in about 20 to 25 minutes left on the clock. If you're in a 15-minute range, you're not bad, but you're definitely on the slower side. And if you're less than that, then you have a lot to work on. Because honestly, the outside fort phase is really, really easy at this point. And if you struggle with that, then it's usually comes down to army fundamentals, and people are not like actually going for healers. Because healers out on defense are just not safe when you're at this point in the game, where it's like early on, and you just need to prio them. And once you prio them, stuff falls a lot easier. So yeah, that's what I have for this one, guys, and I will see you guys in the next video.